the Middle East with Dr. Brovkin. Today's topic will be Caliphs or decline of the Golden Age, decline of the Abbasid dynasty, and that is what happened after Mamun. So just to remind you, Mamun is the continuation of the glorious age after Harun Rashid. This is the time of the House of Wisdom. This is the time of spectacular achievements in science, in medicine, in philosophy. This is the time of these 1001 Nights, the literature flourishing. Everything is absolutely spectacular. But then there are problems we discussed, and the problems is the problem of succession, which is rivalry between the two sons. Then there's a problem with governors that become more and more unruly, and then there's a problem with the viziers or the government that gets to be more and more influential. However, all that is in the future, and it's not yet a problem. Mamun dies in 833. And the last I checked, it's not that he just died. There is a suspicion that he may have been poisoned. And that's already the beginning of a pattern that will be more and more in use in the future lives of future caliphs. In any case, the next caliph who comes after Mamun is Mutasim. His name is. And this is already the beginning of the shaking up of the power of the Abbasid caliphs. There are rebellions brewing in various provinces, and to deal with these rebellions, Mutasim invents a new procedure, which I mentioned last class, which is to bring in foreign troops. And so he hires the Turks. Now, the Turks were a nomadic people who were obviously not Muslim, and who were coming in these droves, in kind of waves from Central Asia. And they will continue to come until they overrun the whole Middle East and take over in the Ottoman Empire. But at this time, these are just kind of tribesmen, horsemen, who come out of Central Asia, and who are really excellent fighters and excellent riders. And so this is why they are hired to be a mercenary army. That means army for hire. So Mutasim hires 4,000 Turkish fighters to be his guards. Now the reason for that is that as we know, Mamun had a problem with the rebels that were flaring up in the outskirts, sort of in northern Iran. And then there was fighting over Baghdad, if you remember the different claimants, and then there was a rebellion against him by his uncle. So basically, the purpose is to have a reliable force that would be loyal to the Sultan, or in this case, it is the Caliph, regardless of who the enemy is. You basically tell them to fight, and they do it. Also, because of this instability, Mutasim moves the capital out of Baghdad. Baghdad becomes ungovernable or not safe, and he moves it to a new place which is called Samarra. And that town still exists on the Tigris River, Samarra, the ancient capital as well. That's pretty much all we could say about Mutasim, is that he is the initiator of this change that would have catastrophic consequences for the Abbasid Caliphate and generally for the Caliphate, which is the transition to a hired army of the Turks. Now, the next period, which would be from 836 to 892, there were 8 caliphs. So it's a time of instability. And increasingly, the pattern that we see in government is that the next caliph is not the worthy one. The next caliph is often chosen by, as I told you before, either the vizier or the army or both. So in a sense, it's the caliphs are beginning to lose power. And usually there is more than one claimant, and that means because these caliphs have obviously many wives, and that means they have many children, and that means there are several sons who can potentially compete for power. So One of the caliphs we could mention is Mutawakil. Mutawakil. He is sort of represents typically this age, which is essentially lack of interest in politics, in government and administration. So unlike Mamun, unlike Rashid, who were interested in politics, in government, in business affairs, in taxes, in administration, in addition to art and poetry and music. Mutawakil basically spends his time in harem with his wives or slave girls. And one other thing he introduces is he needs the money and he begins to sell offices to raise money. To sell offices is another suicidal act, because if you sell it to somebody like governorship or tax collector, this person is going to get his money back real fast by essentially raising taxes on the population and delivering some of it to this Caliph and keeping most of it for himself. In other words, you lose control. When you sell an office, a public office, first of all, it's corruption, but secondly, it's very bad because it's immediate money, but it's long-term loss. But that's the problem. He was interested in immediate money. He needs the money right now, and he doesn't think what's going to happen down the road and how it's going to affect his political power. So, as a result, you have bad governance. I remember I described to you what's good governance. Good governance is taxes are collected, services are provided to the population, such as canals need to be maintained. If the canals and irrigation systems are maintained, then there is water and then there are crops. And if there's crops, people have something to eat. If in the Middle East, in any country, including Morocco, you neglect the canals, then it turns very quickly into a desert. If there's water, there's life. If there's no water, there's no life. It's just as simple as that. Same thing in Iraq. You need the canals and irrigation to bring this water to the fields outside of the rivers, and that means that you have to always maintain them. You have to have somebody taking care of them. Now, if you don't, then they deteriorate very quickly, and that means there'll be less food, and that means less money available and less taxes, which means you become poor. As a result, there's a brewing discontent. There's more and more rebellions. And that means that the political unity of the Caliphate becomes endangered. So here are the crucial dates. 788, Morocco splits away. Now, even before that, as you know, at the time of the beginning of Abbasids, Spain is separate. Spain split away. So in 888, the new dynasty takes over in Morocco. In 801, which is still the time of Rashid, Tunis splits away. In 868, Egypt splits away. And then it seizes Syria, and then you basically have Iran and Iraq, which is what's left of the Caliphate. But even that is not secure, because what today is Iran or Persia dynasty takes over de facto control of Iran, and in 929 Aleppo is split with a Shia dynasty that takes over. Basically, as time goes on, by the time we come to the Crusaders, which is 1099, there's hardly anything left of the Abbasid Caliphate. It's kind of splintered away into smaller principalities. So how typical or untypical it is? One sort of note of consolation to those that are concerned about the fate of Caliphate is that a similar process was going on in Europe. Because if we take Charlemagne's empire, which united all of Germany, all of France, northern Italy, and a little bit of northern Spain, so pretty much all of Western continental Christendom, it all pretty quickly split apart. When he died, he divided up his kingdom on three parts, which actually to a certain extent are still there, which is Germany, France, and the Middle Kingdom, which was Burgundy or Alsace, Lorraine, and Low Countries, Belgium, Holland. They still are independent. They still are stuck between Germany and France. So, in a sense, the grandchildren of Charlemagne divided up the empire, and it continued to splinter. It continued to splinter in smaller and smaller and smaller principalities. And Germany, had about 1,000 little kingdoms by the 19th century. So the process of splintering never ended. So from that point of view, Abbasid Caliphate simply went the same parallel road as the one in Europe. So from that point of view, it was nothing else. But there was a little difference. And the difference was in Europe, you did have a first son gets all the power. And gets all the money, and here in the Middle East it was not. So the lack of transition of power was a serious problem that continued the process of splintering. We focus on Muqtadir. So you will already recognize, if we ask a question, how come he becomes Caliph? He's chosen by the vizier. So this is already a pattern that is established, not by the preceding Caliph, but by the vizier as a minor between the two sons. And of course the question is, why would they choose a minor? The answer is very simple, because they would like to control him while he is a boy, so that the viziers have the power and the Caliph is kept out of power. What should also be mentioned is that in the 10th century, which is 900, the Golden Age continues. That the political splintering of the Caliphate does not stop the sciences and the achievements of scholars. The observatories continue to exist. The Golden Age goes on. The hospitals are there. The House of Wisdom is there. The new cities are being built, magnificent cities such as Cairo. So it's not the end of the story. It's going to continue. Politically, there is instability. Politically, there is intrigue and a dramatic shift of power. One thing that needs to be mentioned here is the war of the Greeks. So Muqtadir, as many others before him, continues the fights against the Byzantine Empire. And the reason that particular war is important, you will see, is because there's testimony, because there's a letter of the Greek ambassadors, which I will partly read to you now. So the Greeks did very well. They won the war. And they imposed a tribute on the Abbasid, on Muqtadir. It's exactly the way it was in the time of Mamun, except at that time the Greeks were paying to Mamun, and now they won, and they imposed a tribute so that Muqtadir pays to them. So they just basically reversed the roles. So they had to pay 120,000 golden pieces, and to collect the money, you have a Greek ambassadors who come to Baghdad to get the money. And so now I'm going to read you a short passages from the description, because they are absolutely incredible description of what Baghdad looked like and what the Greek ambassadors saw when they arrived to the palace of Muqtadir. This is absolutely extraordinary, and it's fantastic that a document like this survived, because there are very few descriptions of what it was like, but this is actually written by the Greek ambassadors who did come to Baghdad and wrote what they saw. And so here's their description. Then it was commanded that the ambassadors should be taken round the palace. Further, the store chambers had been opened, and the treasures therein had been set out, as is customary for the bride's array, the jewels of the Caliph being arranged in trays on steps and covered with cloth of black brocade. When the ambassadors entered the palace of the tree and gazed upon the tree, their astonishment was great. For there they saw birds fashioned out of silver and whistling with every motion, while perched on a tree of silver, weighing 500 dirham. Now the wonder of the ambassadors was greater at seeing these than any other sights that they had ever seen. The number of hangings in the palace of the Caliph was 38,000. These were curtains of gold and brocade, embroidered with gold, all magnificently figured with representations of drinking vessels and with the elephants and horses and camels and lions and birds. Then the Greek envoys walked over such carpets all the way from the limit of the new official gate right to the presence of the Caliph, but the number did not include the fine rugs and in the chambers in the hall of assembly. The envoys of the Greek emperor, being brought to the hall of the official gate, were taken first to the palace known as the Han al-Hayl, the Cavalry House. This was a palace that was for the most part, a court with marble columns. On the right side of this house stood 500 horses, caparisoned each with a saddle of gold and silver, while on the other end stood 500 horses with brocade saddled with long head hook covers. Also, every horse was held by hand by a groom magnificently dressed. Then the Greek ambassadors were taken to the park of wild beasts. This was a palace with various kinds of wild animals therein, who entered it from the park and came up close to the visitors, sniffing them and eating from their hands. Next to the envoys went out of the palace where stood 4 elephants, caparisoned in peacock silk brocade, and the back of which were 8 men of Sind, which means from India, with javelin men with fire, and the sight of these caused much terror to the Greeks. Then they came to a palace where there were 100 lions, 50 to the right hand and 50 to the left, every lion being held by the hand of its keeper, and about its head were neck iron chains. Then the envoys were passed with what was called the new kiosk, which is the palace in the middle of the 2 gardens. In the center was the artificial pond of white lead. This pond had a tank extended in the garden with lawns and palm trees, and it is said that the number was 400 and height of each 5 cubits. Now the entire height of these trees from top to bottom was enclosed in carved teak wood, encircled with gilt copper rings, and all these palms bore full-grown dates, which were not quite ripe. Round the sides of the garden were also citrons and other kinds of fruit. The ambassadors went out of this palace and next came to the palace of the tree, where there is a tree standing in the middle of a great circular pond filled with clear water. The tree had 18 branches, every branch having numerous twigs, on which sat all sorts of gold and silver birds, both large and small. Most of the branches of the tree were made of silver, but some were made of gold, and they spread into the air, carrying leaves of diverse colors. The leaves of the tree move as the wind blows, while the birds and the pipe sing. Next, the Greek envoys entered the palace of the paradise. Here there were carpets and furniture in such quantity as cannot be detailed or enumerated. Around the hall were hung 10,000 gilded breastplates. From thence the ambassadors went forth, crossing a corridor that was 3 cubits in length, in either side of which hung some 10,000 pieces of armor and helmets and caskets, coats of arms and others. Then at length, after the ambassadors had been thus taken around 23 palaces, they were brought forth to the court of the 90. Here were the pages, which means the servants of the privy council, fully armed, sumptuously dressed, each admirable statue. In their hands they carried swords, small battle axes, and maces. The ambassadors next passed down the lines formed by the black slaves, the deputy chamberlains, the soldiers, the footmen, and the sons of the chieftains, until they again came to the presence hall. Now there was a great number of Slavic eunuchs in all these palaces, who during the visit were occupied, listen to this, were occupied in offering to the ambassadors water cooled with snow to drink. Also sherbets and beer, and some other slaves went round the ambassadors, to whom as they walked or sat, they brought them to other palaces. Water was offered, and they drank. Finally, they came again to the presence of Caliph Mukhtadir, whom they found in the palace of the crowns, upon the bank of the Tigris. He was arrayed in clothes embroidered in gold, being seated in an ebony throne, overlaid with embroidered in gold likewise, and on his head was the tall bonnet called Gala Suva. Suspended on the height of the thrones were 9 necklaces, like prayer beads, on the left 7 others. Before the Caliph stood 5 of his sons, 3 to the right and 2 of the left. Then the ambassadors with their interpreter halted before Muqtadir and stood in the posture of humility, and their arms crossed. So this is a spectacular description of the palaces of Baghdad at the time of Muqtadir. However, to finish his story, he was almost overthrown because the people of Baghdad didn't like that he had to pay so much to the Greek ambassadors, and there was an attempt to overthrow him, and in the end his tumultuous rule ended when he was killed in 932 outside city gates. Nobody knows exactly, but the rumor is that it's the Turkish guards, his own security detail, that killed him in 932, ending his reign. Thank you.